Most modern campers trust expensive sleeping bags to keep them alive in the cold. World War II soldiers trusted something very different. In the frozen forests of Europe, men survived nights far colder than most Americans will ever face without luxury gear, without perfect conditions, and often without sleeping bags at all. What kept them alive was not comfort. It was physics, discipline, and a brutally simple thermal system modern survival culture has almost completely forgotten. This documentary examines the World War II shelter tube, a survival method born in combat, refined under lethal pressure, and quietly abandoned after the war. To understand it, we have to step away from temperature ratings and marketing claims, and look at how armies actually endured prolonged exposure to cold when failure meant frostbite, amputation, or death. What winter warfare revealed about insulation was harsher than any camping trip. By the winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American infantry units found themselves in the Ardennes forest under conditions that exposed the limits of issued cold weather gear. Snowfall, sub-freezing temperatures, and relentless dampness created an environment where sleeping bags alone were not enough. Many units did not even have full winter equipment when the German offensive began. Resupply was delayed. Improvisation became doctrine overnight. The assumption before the war had been straightforward: issue insulated bags, wool blankets, and winter uniforms, and soldiers would endure. But cold weather survival is not a static equation. Insulation fails when compressed. Down loses effectiveness when wet. Wool, though more resilient, becomes heavy and slow to dry, and in forests thick with snow-laden branches, everything becomes wet eventually. What frontline troops learned quickly was that surviving the night required more than wrapping oneself in insulation. It required controlling conduction, convection, and moisture simultaneously. A sleeping bag addressed only one part of that equation. The shelter tube emerged because ground and wind were deadlier than air temperature. The shelter tube was not a manufactured product. It was a field method. Soldiers used shelter halves, standard-issue canvas tent sections, combined with blankets, overcoats, and sometimes captured materials to create a low-profile enclosed sleeping cylinder close to the ground. Two men would often combine their shelter halves, buttoning or tying them into a narrow tube just large enough to slide into side by side. This configuration reduced convective heat loss dramatically. Wind, not just cold air, strips away the thin boundary layer of warmth the body naturally creates. By enclosing themselves in a tight canvas tube, soldiers stabilized that boundary layer. The tube did not provide heavy insulation on its own. Instead, it created a microclimate that trapped shared body heat. Ground insulation was handled separately. Pine boughs, straw, spare clothing, or folded packs were layered beneath the tube to prevent conductive heat loss into frozen soil. The principle was simple: preserve trapped air beneath and around the body. The tube reduced wind. The ground layer stopped conduction. Shared body heat raised internal temperature incrementally. It was not comfortable. It was efficient. Shared heat was not a sign of weakness but a rational thermal strategy. Modern outdoor culture often frames sleeping as an individual activity. Each person has a personal bag, personal pad, personal space. In combat, separation meant wasted energy. Two soldiers inside a shelter tube generated more combined heat than either could alone. The enclosed volume was small enough that their metabolic output meaningfully warmed the interior. This was not theoretical. It was observed repeatedly during winter campaigns in Europe and, earlier on the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa. German troops, initially unprepared for Soviet winter conditions, improvised communal sleeping arrangements in barns, dugouts, and hastily constructed shelters. Those who slept in enclosed, shared environments retained more warmth and suffered fewer cold injuries than those isolated in exposed positions. American units, particularly in forested sectors, formalized similar practices out of necessity. Quartermaster reports from late 1944 emphasize the importance of minimizing air volume around sleeping soldiers. Smaller enclosed spaces were just easier to warm. The shelter tube achieved that without requiring additional manufactured equipment. Moisture management was treated as a daily discipline, not just an afterthought. One reason modern sleeping bags fail in severe conditions is moisture accumulation. Even high-end down bags degrade rapidly when they're repeatedly exposed to condensation, wet clothing, and damp ground. Soldiers in World War II learned that insulation saturated from within was just as dangerous as external snowfall. The shelter tube system addressed this indirectly. Because it relied less on thick, lofted fill and more on wind reduction and shared heat, it was less vulnerable to catastrophic insulation collapse when damp. Wool blankets, while heavy, retained some insulating value even when moist. Canvas, though not waterproof, blocked wind effectively and dried more predictably than down. Equally important were routines. Wet socks were removed. Outer layers were brushed free of snow before entering the tube. Whenever daylight and conditions allowed, bedding was aired out. These habits were enforced not for comfort, but for operational survival. A soldier who lost warmth at night was less effective the next day. Fatigue compounded quickly in freezing environments. Why modern sleeping bags struggle in wet, windy environments. Contemporary camping gear excels in controlled testing conditions. Temperature ratings are assigned under standardized laboratory scenarios, but battlefield winters rarely resembled laboratories. Snow melted into clothing during marches, then refroze overnight. Wind shifted unexpectedly. Shelter construction time was limited. High loft down performs exceptionally well in dry cold. But it performs poorly when wet and compressed. In a foxhole or shallow scrape in frozen soil, a thick bag pressed against the ground loses much of its insulating airspace. Without a high R-value pad beneath it, even an expensive bag just can't prevent heat from draining into the earth. The World War II shelter tube did not rely on loft thickness alone. Instead, it reduced exposed surface area and leveraged metabolic heat from more than one body. In physics terms, it minimized heat loss pathways instead of merely increasing insulation thickness. This distinction really matters. Adding more insulation is not always the most efficient solution. Sometimes, reducing heat exchange can be more effective, especially when materials are limited. Post-war prosperity changed how Americans thought about outdoor survival. After 1945, the United States experienced economic expansion and technological innovation that transformed recreational camping. Lightweight nylon tents replaced heavy canvas. Synthetic insulation evolved. Consumer culture emphasized convenience and personal comfort. Outdoor marketing, well, it framed nature as an experience to be enjoyed rather than endured. In that shift, certain survival-oriented habits faded. Shared sleeping systems came to be seen as primitive or unnecessary. Individual sleeping bags became symbols of preparedness and autonomy. The idea of deliberately minimizing interior space to conserve heat seemed outdated in an era of improved materials. Yet military cold weather doctrine did not forget these lessons. During the early Cold War, planners preparing for potential conflict in Northern Europe revisited winter survival systems extensively. Training emphasized proper ground insulation, windbreak construction, and strict moisture control. The physics remained unchanged, even as materials improved. The shelter tube concept survived in modified forms within military fieldcraft, though rarely under that name. Discipline mattered more than equipment. One consistent theme across winter campaigns of the Second World War was that equipment alone did not determine survival rates. Units with identical issued gear experienced different levels of cold injury, depending on enforcement of routine. Leaders who required soldiers to airbedding, rotate socks, and construct proper ground layers saw measurable benefits. This principle extends beyond military history. Survival in cold environments depends on behavior as much as gear. A moderately rated bag used intelligently outperforms a premium bag used carelessly. A windbreak hastily constructed from available materials can dramatically reduce heat loss. Sharing warmth, when appropriate and safe, multiplies thermal efficiency. The World War II shelter tube represents a mindset more than a product. It reflects an understanding that survival is systemic. Shelter, insulation, airflow, moisture, and human cooperation interact. Ignoring any one of those elements weakens the whole. Why remembering this matters beyond camping? Winter was not a background condition in World War II. It shaped outcomes. During Operation Barbarossa, cold exposure contributed to stalled advances and massive attrition. During the Battle of the Bulge, freezing conditions tested logistics and endurance on both sides. Soldiers who preserved strength overnight were more capable of holding lines, launching counterattacks, and maintaining morale. Understanding the shelter tube and similar methods really deepens our appreciation for how wars are sustained. Strategy operates at the level of armies, but honestly, endurance operates at the level of bodies just trying to conserve heat through the night. Modern campers, well, they rarely face comparable stakes. Yet the environment, it doesn't distinguish between recreational and combat exposure. Cold remains governed by the same laws of thermodynamics. Wind still strips warmth. Wet insulation still fails. Ground still absorbs heat relentlessly. The difference is that wartime soldiers could not call for extraction if their system failed. The lesson modern survival culture often overlooks. The most important takeaway from the World War II shelter tube is not that modern gear is inferior. It is that comfort-focused thinking can obscure survival fundamentals. Marketing emphasizes extreme temperature ratings, ultralight materials, and personal space. Wartime experience emphasized minimizing heat loss pathways, enforcing drying discipline, and leveraging shared resources. Physics has not changed since 1944. Trapped air insulates. Moisture degrades. Wind accelerates loss. Shared heat accumulates. Systems outperform isolated components. Remembering these lessons honors more than ingenuity. It honors the reality that survival in extreme conditions was achieved not through luxury equipment, but through disciplined application of basic principles under pressure. History is often told through battles and leaders, but endurance stories, how men stayed alive through freezing nights in forests far from supply lines, reveal a different dimension of conflict. They show that small, practical systems can carry strategic weight. If you value this kind of careful, in-depth exploration of overlooked wartime realities, subscribe to Hidden in History. And if this examination of the World War II shelter tube added to your understanding of survival and military endurance, share the video with others who appreciate serious historical analysis.